There's a version of you that never once sees a doctor, never takes a pill, never gets a single stitch, and somehow still survives everything the world throws at it. Because that version of you isn't hypothetical. That was every human being for nearly 300,000 years. And people got sick back then. People got badly hurt. People caught infections that, by every modern medical standard, should have killed them, and yet most of the time they didn't die, even though there were no antibiotics and no idea that bacteria even existed. So, how did they survive? The real answer is far stranger than anything you were ever taught in school, and it starts with something as simple as a wound. Picture a hunter slicing his leg open on a sharp rock, out in the open, with no antiseptic and no bandage anywhere in sight. Within days, an infection would normally start creeping in. So, what actually happened next? In most cases, the answer was plants. Long before chemistry had a name or a discipline, humans were already practicing it, testing which leaves stopped bleeding faster, which bark seemed to break a fever, and which roots dulled pain enough to sleep through the worst of it. And here's the strange part. Humans weren't even the first species to figure any of this out. Primatologist Michael Huffman spent years studying wild chimpanzees in Tanzania, and he noticed something odd, that sick chimps would seek out specific bitter plants that healthy chimps completely ignored, even though those plants had almost no nutritional value at all. When Huffman had the plants tested in a lab, the reason became clear. They contained compounds that killed intestinal parasites, which meant the chimps weren't just snacking out of curiosity. They were medicating themselves on purpose, a behavior scientists now call zoopharmacognosy, or self-medication in animals. And if a chimpanzee can find real medicine hidden inside a forest with no lessons and no teacher at all, it's not hard to imagine what a human with a far bigger brain and a much longer memory could learn to find and pass down. But plants had their limits because plants couldn't set a broken bone, and they definitely couldn't help deliver a breech baby or save someone who had just lost an entire arm. For problems that severe, ancient humans needed something rarer than any herb in the forest. They needed each other, and that's where the story gets genuinely strange. In 1957, archaeologists digging through Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq uncovered the skeleton of a Neanderthal man, now known as Shanidar I, who lived roughly 45,000 years ago. His right arm had been amputated below the elbow long before he died. He was blind in one eye, and he had somehow survived a severe skull fracture as well. By any reasonable modern standard, a man with those injuries should never have made it out of childhood, let alone grown into an adult who lived for years, possibly even decades afterward. Paleoanthropologist Eric Trinkhaus, who studied those remains closely, came to a blunt conclusion that Shanidar I simply could not have hunted or defended himself with injuries like that. Someone had to have fed him. Someone had to have protected him, keeping him alive long after his body stopped pulling its own weight within the group. And remarkably, he wasn't even close to being the oldest case like this ever discovered. In the Republic of Georgia, at a site called Dmanisi, researcher David Lord-Kipinidze uncovered a skull nearly 1.8 million years old, belonging to a person who had lost every single tooth years before dying, with the bone already fully healed around the empty sockets. Losing every tooth meant no chewing meat, no cracking nuts, nothing solid at all, and yet this person clearly lived on for a long time afterward. Someone was softening food for him. Someone was sharing what little there was to go around, which means that almost 2 million years ago, long before language and long before fire in some regions, care for the weak was already quietly happening. Archaeologist Lorna Tilley has spent her career studying cases exactly like these, building an entire field of research around the idea, known as the bioarchaeology of care. In Vietnam, at a site called Man Bac, researchers uncovered the 4,000-year-old skeleton of a young man who had been paralyzed from the waist down, and who still managed to live for years afterward with no wheelchair, no medicine, and no real understanding of paralysis at all. Someone fed him every day. Someone cleaned him. Someone carried him from place to place again and again with nothing obvious to gain from any of it. So here's the real question worth sitting with. Why would anyone bother From a purely cold survival standpoint, none of this behavior makes much sense, because every meal handed to someone who couldn't hunt was a meal the rest of the group didn't have somewhere else, and every hour spent caring for the sick was an hour not spent gathering food. If survival of the fittest really were the whole story, the ruthless groups that abandoned their wounded should have quietly outcompeted the ones that didn't, generation after generation. But that isn't remotely what the bones show. Over and over again, across tens of thousands of years, humans chose to keep their sick and injured alive anyway. And that turns out to be the real answer to how ancient humans survived without doctors. It was never really about the medicine at all. It was about the people standing around you. Getting sick in a small hunting band wasn't a private, isolated event the way it often feels today. It was a group event, start to finish. If you had a fever, someone sat beside you through the night. If you couldn't walk, someone simply carried you. Your own immune system did the actual fighting against the infection, but the people around you kept your body alive long enough for that fight to actually matter. Anthropologists studying the Hadza people of Tanzania today still watch this exact same pattern unfold in real time, where illness reliably triggers care rather than abandonment. It isn't just sentimentality either, it's strategy, because a group that keeps its members alive also keeps its knowledge alive. And in a world without written language, knowledge only ever survives inside living minds. There's one more piece of this puzzle, and it might be the strangest one of all. Ancient humans lived surrounded by dirt, animals, and an environment thick with microbes from the very moment they were born. Researcher Jeff Leach, studying the gut bacteria of modern hunter-gatherer groups, discovered something remarkable: that their microbiomes are dramatically more diverse than those of people living in industrialized cities today. And that diversity appears to be linked to lower rates of inflammation and fewer autoimmune diseases overall. In other words, the dirt that would horrify you today may have quietly built one of the strongest immune systems a human body has ever carried. So picture it all together now. A Neanderthal missing an entire arm, alive for decades simply because his group refused to let him go. An elderly man with no teeth left at all, fed by hands that weren't his own. Nearly 2 million years before you were born. A chimpanzee chewing on bitter leaves it somehow already knew would save its life. None of that looks anything like the survival of the fittest you learned about in school. It looks a lot more like the survival of the connected, and it seems to have been the plan the entire time. Which brings you right back to this very moment. Back to a small cut healing quietly on your skin without a single conscious thought from you. And back to a body that still expects, automatically, that someone will show up the moment something goes seriously wrong. You live in a world where sickness has quietly become something you're expected to handle alone. You search your symptoms online instead of asking a neighbor for help. You see a doctor you've met maybe twice rather than a tight-knit group that has known you your entire life. But your ancestors never had a single pharmacy, and they still managed to survive everything the world could possibly throw at them, because they had something modern medicine still struggles to fully replicate: a guarantee that when your body eventually failed you, you would never be left to fail alone. There is a version of you that never truly needed a doctor, not because nothing ever went wrong, but because someone was always there long before it did.